All right. Welcome to the Performance University, the second lesson. So by now, you've probably watched the first session already, right? And this is the way that I've put together this course so that there's a series of from step one to step two to step three. Hopefully, you gotten sort of the idea of how I sort of orient this course, how I navigate this holistic healthcare or the wheel, as I call it. And today's no exception, right? We're going to get right into discussing some of the elements that I think is really important for you to understand post-athlete career. So again, let's go back to square one of what I was trying to accomplish with this. Former Athlete Society is all about trying to bridge that gap from your playing days to your professional days, right? And there's not many services or communities that really exist in this space. And this is why I think it's so important for us to navigate this. Now, hopefully, you've learned all of this in university, right? And I understand that not everybody is a exercise science major, kinesiology, major, anything like that. Some of you guys might have different degrees, and that's perfectly okay. But somewhere along that, you should have had an RD or a nutritionalist that taught you some of these things. You should have an athletic trainer that taught you about recovery. You should have a strength and conditioning coach that talked to that shared um, methodologies or principles or lessons about your training and your body. You should have a sports psychologist that talked to you about training your mind, right? But if you didn't, that's fine. That's what we're here for. That's what I'm here to help bridge that gap and provide this sort of lesson for you. So let's jump into it. We're taking a whole lap around this wheel. So we're going to first discuss carbohydrates and what really is a carbohydrate. So we hear them, they're often vilified uh, in the news and in nutritional books, but carbs are your energy source. They are your primary energy source. So if you were to think just conventionally, these are typically your fruits, right? They are typically your starchy vegetables, your grains, your rices, your in some respects, dairy products have some carbohydrates in it. And then, like on the far right, snacks and sweets and juices, things like that. They have carbohydrates. Yes, legumes and different types of beans also have carbohydrates. So carbs make up a large majority of different food types and different, obviously different just styles and things that you could eat, right? Again, 1 gram of carbohydrate equates to 4 calories. So last lesson, I talked about energy density. I talked about fats being one of the more dense macronutrients. We talked about that again in the last lesson as far as macronutrients being proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Fats being one of the more energy dense macronutrients out there. Carbohydrates, 4 calories for every 1 gram of carbohydrates. So it is a great energy source. And what I'm trying to teach or I'm trying to express is there's a really, really big difference from, I'm just looking where my hand is, from the what's on the left side of the screen over here versus what's over my head. This, right? This is your sugary snacks and sweets, right? It's a carbohydrate. Don't get me wrong. A pastry is a carbohydrate. Your jelly beans are carbohydrates, right? We see our athletes unfortunately eat these things all the time. Your sodas exist, mostly sugars, right? And sugar is a carbohydrate. But a really healthy version of carbohydrates are once again on, boy, this side of the screen over here, right? So those are, again, your fruits and your vegetables and your starches. Those are going to be more caloric, not necessarily calorically more dense, but they're going to contain sort of the phytochemicals and the nutrients that your body actually needs. It's going to deliver way more um, things and uh, minerals and vitamins that your body actually needs and exists and needs to exist. So that's really important concept to understand. So in this, what I'm trying to express is simple sugars. Sorry, I'm just closing a little bit of my screen. Simple sugars, yeah, these carbohydrates, they are digested super quickly, right? And they can cause a rapid increase in blood sugar levels. You pound the sugary sweets, you're going to see your blood sugars exponentially rise, right? And they're typically utilized for immediate energy needs. But when we think of long-term, sustainable energy delivery, simple sugars are not the mechanism that we want to commonly use. There's a famous article about Dwight Howard, NBA basketball athlete, and this guy was addicted to candy, like sugar, 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 sugar. He had sugar, like every type of candies in his locker rooms, on his couch, at home, in his car, in his vehicle, and his like, and blood sugars were just rising and rising and rising. And one of his transformations with this physical body was working with his RD and his strength and conditioning coach to actually change his nutrition and change his diet. And that made a huge jump in his ability to actually perform and play basketball at a really high level. So, contrasting that, complex carbohydrates are digested more slowly, right? They cause a gradual increase in blood sugar levels. They contain they're typically higher sources of fiber, and the nutrients are used for longer, more sustained release of those energy needs. And that's really important for athletes as we start to think about what our energy expenditure is going to be, what are our energy needs going to be, and how do we put together a performance plate that allows us to have the primary foundation of it being complex carbohydrates, maybe with the tip of that sort of triangle that you see on the screen represented in your simple sugars or your fast-acting sort of delivery of blood sugar. So I use this example all the time with our athletes that both of these products contain carbohydrates. It's just that one has whole grains and more fibers and has other sort of nuts and seeds and is essentially, well, here's the punchline. It's the oatmeal, right? And we can understand that this product right here is going to be drastically different than this one on the left side of the screen. One is actually oats. The other is kind of a candy bar. And so both of which has carbohydrates in it, but the delivery of that sugar is going to be drastically different between the two foods, right? In another exercise that I share with our athletes, and I'm sharing with you right now as a former athlete, is that on the left side of the screen, that's a whole wheat bagel. Both are circular, both have a hole, both are objects that you can eat with one hand, essentially the same, but the flour is different. One is produced with whole wheats, essentially like wheat flour, and another is going to be enriched sort of white flour. So this one right above my head, this guy will deliver sugars much more rapidly than the one on the other side of the screen over there. So a lesson I share with our athletes when it comes to carbohydrate intake is that when in doubt, just generally, right, think brown and close to the ground. And what I mean by that is the browner or whole grain variation or alternative of a carbohydrate fuel source, that is going to typically be a healthier, more slower release of those sugars, of that sort of glycogen or carbohydrate into our body. And it's going to be a slower release of that. And that's really important because then that energy is a little bit more sustainable and you won't have this rapid release or rapid spike of blood sugar and a release of insulin or a hormone called insulin in our body as well. So when in doubt, if you're at a restaurant, if you're navigating your home, you're in the grocery store, think brown, and think close to the ground. And what I mean by that is the more it can be real food, something that's, farmers will cultivate, typically will be a healthier variation as well, and will be less processed and will won't spike our blood sugars as much. Now, this is a question I get all the time, and I'm sort of in front of the graphic, so I don't necessarily know if you can actually see that as well. I'll try to see if I can move me around a little bit in this live recording. Um, so let's do this. I'm going to just move myself to the opposite side of the screen. Now I'm over here. So a typical serving size. I get this all the time from athletes, right? And we know like we exhaust ourselves, we go hard, we're fatigued. At the end of the day, you just want to eat, you want to pound food, you want to eat food, right? And athletes are some of the most notable eaters that I've seen for the most case, right? We always have some rare exceptions as well, but for the most part, athletes can really put away food. And that's great because your body is your machine and you need to fuel that machine for high performance and production and output of whatever sporting endeavor that we do. When you transition out of athletics, those behaviors don't necessarily change. But what does change is your energy expenditure, right? You're no longer practicing for 2.5, 3 hours a day. You're no longer lifting for an hour a day, right? For most of us, we're transitioning into a professional realm. We're in offices, we're doing things different than what we were doing on the playing field. So I say that is that these are our typical serving sizes. So we have starches, right? And that's about the size of a fist. And then 2 hands would be the size of your vegetables, right? Just trying to pop this open a little bit more of your fruits and your vegetables. So starches, when in doubt, think your hand, right? About the size of this. So this would be your, your rice, your baked potato, your yams, your sweet potatoes, right? But if you were going to have some broccoli or things like that, something that you could scoop and hold like a bowl of your 2 hands is a typical serving size for that. So hopefully this gets us thinking, okay, we've talked about macronutrients, but now we're talking about carbohydrates and I'll get into more lessons. I have way more materials about carbohydrates and energy sources and how much and when and timing and all these things. But for right now, I just wanted us to start to think brown and close to the ground and the appropriate serving sizes, the fist of your hand and a double hand scoop for your fruits and vegetables. So moving on, right? I want to move to the next series of this and start to discuss a little bit about the body. But first, before I do, let's go ahead and slide myself over. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. And this is a fun topic, right? But it's also a topic that's somewhat taboo in sports. And I've worked in female athletics all of my career. And so this is something that is quite frankly very real in the world of athletics and female athletics. And I wanted to share this with you. It might not be applicable. I understand this audience is both men and women. So if it isn't, don't worry. I got a lot more topics about bodies, but this is right from the get-go, something that I've always discussed with our athletes. And I think it's relevant and necessary to share with you as well. So we will continue to go on. So we're going to talk about the hormonal cycle for our women athletes, those that are transitioning out of college sports. And now you're entering into the workforce. And what you're finding is that maybe for a large majority, and this is somewhat common with the energy expenditure necessary in collegiate sports or high-level sports, you probably experienced this yourself at some point, maybe the loss of a menstrual cycle during different periods of heightened activity and heightened energy expenditure. But what we found and what we often recommend is really getting our women athletics and athletes understanding how training influences this hormonal cycle, right? We often think that training is a one-size-fits-all approach, and what works for men works for women. But quite frankly, there's a lot of nuance into training and essentially working with women athletes, right? So this is a typical, and I'll understand this. I will give myself a little bit of a disclaimer in that no 2 people cycle are exactly the same, right? From cycle to cycle in this hormonal swing of things, it can change. It has variation to it, and the body is quite magnificent and adaptable in that way, and that's what makes it really cool. However, these are just generalities, right? They're not, don't take it as gospel when I say the menstrual phase lasts 1 to 7 days, right? And you're sitting there and you hear that and you're like, well, mine lasts 8 days or mine lasts 9 days. So just understand these are general concepts. They are not written in permanent marker by any extent to these things, but just sort of setting us up for this hormonal cycle. And if you're a guy and you're like me, listen, you might have daughters someday, right? I have a daughter, right? It's important for us to understand this and the implications of their training and their experiences and what comes down the road for them as well. And certainly, you might have a spouse, right? So understanding these things is important regardless of gender. So discussing this, we have several, I kind of broke it out like this when I'm explaining it to athletes like yourself. 4 phases. We have a menstrual phase, which approximately, this is sort of the bleed phase, if you will, and that approximately lasts 7 days, right? We have the follicular phase, and that is, again, you have phase 1 and phase 2, phase 3. I know you guys can see all this. It's presented on the screen, but this is approximately 4 days. We have the ovulation phase, and that's somewhere is about 3 days, and the luteal phase, and that's again, this is approximately 14 days. And there's some variance in all of this, but that makes up our typical cycle. And after we reach phase 4 and the 14 days, again, roughly, goes through, then we'll arrive back at phase 1, that bleed phase, that menstrual phase. So how the body works, though, this is what's really interesting, is you have a series of different hormones in our body. So we have like progesterone and estrogen, and all of these things are in constant flux with each other. It's really like a cool synchronized dance with each other. So estrogen and progesterone levels are at their lowest during that period, that bleed phase, right? And you can see it on the graphic as we're working our way through this cycle. We're in that sort of represented under phase 1 and that sort of green. And then after those 7 days, estrogen levels are rising to a peak just before the ovulation phase, so the follicular phase is only 4 days roughly. And so estrogen levels are rising rapidly into that peak. And then the progesterone levels are still generally pretty low. And then as we get into that phase 3, the ovulation phase, estrogen levels starts to have a rapid decline and starts to drop as ovulation occurs. And then both estrogen and progesterone starts to rise again, right? Now, when it gets to the luteal phase, estrogen and progesterone levels decline to their lowest point, right? Right before the next menstrual phase. So this is sort of the synchronized dance that happens in a body for women and for, female athletes. And it's important to understand sort of the chemical process of our bodies and the hormonal swings of progesterone and estrogen during these phases, because they have large implications of how we actually train. So in phase 1, these are generalities again, right? And I've already talked about the upper left sort of picture up there as far as what happens from a hormone perspective. But there's a lot of things that also happen to our bodies during this phase. And this is well researched through organizations like Fitter, which specialize in sort of specific training for females. And there's some notable cases as far as like US women's soccer really planning some of their training around their menstrual phase of their athletes to make sure it's appropriate during those phases. And this is what sort of the rest of these slides are sharing, in that muscle activation, like again, neuromuscular control may be lower during this bleed phase, this menstrual phase, right? So including more sort of dynamic muscular warm-up exercises in this sort of 7-day bleed phase is really important, and because it could certainly help with the proprioceptive neuromuscular control that's necessary for sport. In addition, which is sort of kind of counter to what you think a lot, like maximum training benefits during that bleed phase comes from HIIT and strength work, right? And we talked about how estrogen and progesterone levels are at their lowest during this period. So really trying to maximize training during those roughly 7 days is really important. Now, there are implications with bleeding and loss of blood, and one of those things is loss of iron during that blood. So the consumption of iron-rich foods is really important during this phase. Also making sure that we have enough carbohydrates, like we talked about before, to make sure that we're fueling our training, because that's again like it's really challenging on a female's body to have this constant bleeding, and we need to make sure that the glycogen levels in the body and the fueling is adequate to allow for intense enough training to see the benefits of what we need. In addition to that, we also have something as far as let me go back. Anti-inflammatory foods are really important. Why would this be important? Because we need to try to mitigate or certainly help manage some of the menstrual cycle symptoms, right? Whether it's bloating or anything else, or fatigue or anything. So really a heavy focus on the anti-inflammatory foods. And I have lessons that will be coming down that discusses and identifies sort of what are anti-inflammatory foods. But intake of, foods rich in vitamin D, calcium, fish oils, B vitamins, things like that. Now, phase two, after the bleed phase, and we get through the menstrual phase, and we're in this follicular phase. Again, it only lasts roughly around 4 days in this cycle. Um, there's some things like some studies, adaptation of high intensity training has been shown to be superior during this phase. So after the bleed phase is finished, like that's the time to kind of get after it, right? Energy levels start to you will feel typically like they'll start to increase, right? And this is when your energy and strength levels are probably at the highest, right? This is like peaking, on a monthly cycle. This is where like PRs are kind of set. Um, Again, like increase of carbohydrate intake as we're going through it, because to balance out the intensity and the increase in training, healthy balanced diet, soft tissue recovery. What we've seen a lot is that because the increase in training of feeling really good during this follicular phase, having foods that are rich in collagen and vitamin C, and that tends to help with muscle recovery and tendon and ligament recovery as well. So now, after those 4 days sort of come to a conclusion, we go into the ovulation phase. And the ovulation phase, roughly 3 days, plus or minus a little bit. And this is when several things, right? We talked about estrogen levels initially dropping off, and the ovulation actually occurs, and then progesterone and estrogen start to rise and remain pretty darn high, right? So it drops, and then that progesterone starts to rise a little bit. So what are the implications of that? Well, it would be the best time to focus on, improving flexibility, low level conditioning. So this is your zone 1, zone 2, sort of low intensity aerobic conditioning. You might just feel a little bit more beat up during this phase, right? Like a challenge to recover from workout to workout, and that's normal, right? This is something where if your sport requires it, or let's say your pickup league or your softball league or baseball league, whatever, if it requires it, high intensity sessions, you might need some more increase of carbohydrates to fuel those sessions. That's certainly appropriate and probably expected. So the breakdown of muscle might be increased during this phase. So really focusing on during this sort of phase 3 on more protein consumption, right? That would be appropriate to make sure we maintain muscle mass, which is again something that we certainly in the former athlete society is super focused on, is trying to make sure that we maximize muscle gain for a number of different reasons, which we'll get into. But making sure that we're consuming enough protein, both before, during, and probably after the training sessions and throughout the day. And then really towards this phase 3, it's like preparation for phase 4, right? Because really focusing on anti-inflammatory and antioxidant rich foods as we start to approach this. So phase 4, This is the longest of the phases in a typical hormonal cycle or menstrual cycle. And this is, again, plus or minus 14 days. Estrogen, progesterone levels begin that decline to its lowest point right before the next menstrual or bleed phase. And this is a time to really focus on our diet. This is a time to get this right. Again, exercise does have an anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. So really focusing on maintaining your workout structure is important. Managing symptoms, so like premenstrual sort of symptoms is really important. Consumption of foods that are again, anti-inflammatory or antioxidant rich foods are essential. But really focusing, doubling down on sort of the recovery strategies that we teach you here at the Former Athlete Society, and put a great focus on that in your nutrition. And that will typically set our athletes up for success with managing their hormonal cycle. So moving on, right? And shifting a little bit to this mentality piece, this applied sports psychology. I'm sharing just several phenomenal books that have all been somewhat insightful in my journey in applied sports psychology. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I don't pretend to be one. I don't play one on the internet. You will never hear me say that. But as a performance coach, we have to exist in all of these spaces, right? There'll be times where, athletes, when they'll ask you nutrition questions. I'm not an RD. I'm not providing nutritional plans for people. But I am sharing the lessons I've learned throughout the 20 years of being a performance coach with people. So these are just a few really phenomenal books. And I'll share key reasons why in here. But The Inner Game of Tennis, right? And I start with this because when I was a young kid, I was obsessed with the Pac-10. And I was also obsessed with Pete Carroll. And when Pete Carroll ended up writing, and he wrote his book, and he wrote several books at this point, but he cited a lot of Timothy Galloway and talked about how The Inner Game of Tennis was a really pivotal book for him. So being obsessed with Pete Carroll, I had to jump in. I had to buy this book. I had to read this and understand the psychology of why and how we can train the mind to really rethink peak performance and performance anxiety. Kobe Bryant is probably, one of the strongest mentally strongest athletes that are, in the last century that we've probably seen. So Mamba Mentality is a phenomenal book as well. Tim Grover, who was actually a strength and conditioning coach. So shout out to another strength coach here in the Former Athlete Society, wrote a book, From Good to Great to Unstoppable Relentless. Is all about basketball, which is, obviously close to my heart. But he was a strength coach that worked with Chicago Bulls. He's worked with Michael Jordan. He's worked with Kobe Bryant, all of the world's greatest basketball athletes as well. And then lastly, by Dr. Suri Evans, Perform Under Pressure. And if you're unfamiliar with who Dr. Suri Evans is, or Richie McCaw, this is the New Zealand All Blacks. This is their sports psychologist. And he has a really interesting, this book is just chock full from cover to cover with really good applied information regarding psychology and how you can sort of leverage the mind. But I wanted to share a few things from each book that I think will be really important and might give us some moments of reflection as we start to think about psychology and harnessing the mind. So this comes from The Inner Game of Tennis, and I know it's up here. So, and you can read this. This isn't like, I'm not one of these people that love to read things from slides. So, go ahead and read this, spend a little time here. And as you do, I love the idea of placing the mind on one's breathing process. We talk about breath so much in my world, right? How to execute, how to leverage breathing during exercise. But we've already saw on the first lesson that we've talked about this, this double breath, right? That psychological side that Dr. Andrew Huberman shared. And so I say this is that the breathing process is really important, right? But doing so can also really shift our mind into the attention being on the here, the now, the present, right? Not what's next, not what just happened, but the only thing that's well within our control is the present. So I love that aspect, and that's something that we share all the time with our athletes. From Mamba, uh, and this is again from Kobe, right? And he talked about his experiences, and details and the minutia of basketball. But for him, it was so much about training his mind on the court, off the court, every detail in his life. And he did that both in class and practice, on the basketball courts and in the gymnasiums. He strengthened his focus. And he did that. And he shared in the entirety book. And I won't give the entire book away. Just be present, not have a wandering mind. Be where your feet are is really something I share all the time. Be where your feet are. Be right here. Be right now. Not in the future, not where you're going to be in 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. Oh, I got to worry about this class. I got to worry about this meeting I got to go to. I got this. Be right here, right now. Now, from Relentless, and again, from Tim Grover, physical dominance can make you great. Mental dominance is what ultimately makes you unstoppable. This is fantastic. I love this because it's just, again, it's so characteristic of great athletes. And you know this, right? We've all seen this. We probably all experienced this, but phenomenal athletes, great athletes have that ability to tap into their mind. That's what makes them so great. And it's not always the most physically strongest athlete. It's not the one that has the most prowess. It's the athletes that are unbreakable and shakable mentally that often makes up some of the phenomenal athletes and teammates that you probably had or experienced. From the last book, Dr. Sari Evans, right? Big mental shift, performing under pressure, which is a whole different ballgame, right? It comes when we can feel fear, but we can accept deep inside that we will mentally survive, right? So I often say when people feel anxiety or fear, it's somewhat of a signal like maybe we didn't prepare enough, right? And so one of the ways that we can combat that is through preparation, right? And that becomes a journey in itself of how much preparation do you need, how much is too much, how much is what. But boy, one of the ways that you can combat fear is just by preparing relentlessly. And it loses, and he talks about in this book, and the entirety of the book is about applied sports psychology that he leverages and utilizes for the New Zealand All Blacks, the most winningest sporting organization in the world. But he ends up saying that when it's controlled and when you can understand that, it loses its power to overwhelm us. So, phenomenal book, phenomenal book. This next piece is also really important and something I actually have. I don't have them here at my desk right now. But what's really, really cool is what I'm going to share next. And now this is hard to do, I will admit, right? I'm just staring at a screen right now, right? And I can tell you that it is challenging when the world exists, digital world exists, and blue light and screens and bright lights. Oh, it's in my eyes, right? It's everywhere. We see this all of the time. And so I see it more because I probably work with, a demographic of age of people that are always on their phones, right? So 18 to 22-year-olds, that phone is glued to them. So how do we combat that? What do we do to try to shift our recovery environment to be more conducive to better sleep, deeper sleep, faster sleep, longer sleep, more REM cycles? How do we condition the environment so that our sleep isn't impacted and we can actually harness better recovery? So I wanted to share a little bit about, we hear it all the time in the news, but what the heck is blue light, right? So high energy visible light, right? HEV light. It's a color in the visible light spectrum that can actually be seen by the human eyes. And blue light is a short wavelength. And what that means is it produces higher amounts of energy. Now, in this, the science of blue light, right? Blue light typically regulates your circadian rhythm, the wake and sleep cycle, right? And it keeps us awake and alert. So this is really good. Blue light's fine, right? This is why Dr. Andrew Huberman talks quite a bit about getting early morning sun exposure. Like light in the eyes is really important because it helps get us into our wake and sleep cycle and natural rhythm. But watching TV or scrolling through social media when it's late at night is actually quite detrimental to our to essentially our vision and our sleep and all of those things. So it has the opposite effect. So blue light at night actually stimulates your brain. It gets it going. And because of which it slows or it stops the release of a sleep hormone natural to our body, melatonin, and that makes it harder to get into a good night's sleep. And just again, I know it's so prevalent. We've probably seen it, and you might even have teammates that that would, like, hey, let me take some melatonin at night to try to get me to sleep. That's not healthy either, right? That's not a strategy we want to use long term either. What we want to do is shift our environment to be more conducive to sleep so our body can naturally produce melatonin and we don't got to rely on a supplementation to be able to get the thing that our body should be doing. So this was a study from the Journal of Pediatrics that showed that kids who slept near their phones, not even on it, but near their phones. So they're trying to relate if you're sleeping near your phone, you're probably on your phone. Lost 20 minutes of sleep per night, experienced 40% higher insufficient sleep. And that is just crazy. But that's so prevalent. It's in our world right now. It's almost normalized to this point. Now, what do I recommend for people? I recommend, again, avoid using bright screens for 1 to 2 hours before bed. And I'm recommending that to you right now. That's your challenge, right? So I want you to go over to the discussion boards and share, make a post as you're watching this, jump over and share a post about what you're going to try to do to better your sleep because it's really important. Now, you can also try the 20-20-20 rule. And this is, again, a lesson I picked up long ago where you need to look at something 20 feet away for 20 seconds. Just stare at it. 20 feet away for 20 seconds every 20 minutes of screen time. So if you are in an office, right? This is your transition. You went from the sporting world to the corporate world, and you're in an office now. Every 20 minutes, I need you to look away from your computer screen. I know, like, just close the laptop, get away from your monitor, shut down Excel, walk away, go to the water cooler, and just gaze off 20 feet for 20 seconds, locked in every 20 minutes of screen time. Now, underneath that, blue light blocking glasses, amber or brown tinted glasses can help reduce your exposure to blue light. So I don't know if this will work. So we're going to do this live. Maybe I fade off. Here I am. I'm fading off, fading off, fading off. No, I'm not. Okay, I'm coming back. But I actually have my blue light blocking glasses right behind me. I was going to grab them, but I know the next slide shares some, right? So you can get them commercially available, right? Whoop makes some, which is a wearable technology that I actually wear on this wrist right here. So I can quantify my sleep, my REM, my deep sleep, my light sleep, my wake disturbances, right? I end up wearing blue light blocking glasses every single night once I get past 7 p.m. because I'm starting to downregulate at that time. I'm trying to shift my body into sleep mode and not wake mode. So that is if you can't escape screen time, then I certainly recommend trying to acquire some blue light blocking glasses or amber or like they're typically a more orange lens to block that out. I also recommend, if you're not already doing this, is shifting night shift on and turning that on earlier during the day. It says a lot of the times it will kick on, an hour or two. You can set the time to turn this on, but making sure that night shift is activated on your phone as well. I will say though, as I go back to this slide here, I often shift. You can go to the accessibility component in your settings. This is an Apple device, iOS settings, accessibility, and you can turn on color filters and you can turn on a quick mode. So I triple click my side button on my iPhone and it shifts my screen red. It cuts out all the blue light at least the visible blue light from it. I also wear my lenses, so I feel like I'm getting a double whammy on this, but it makes the screen red. I've also done it where I've taken all the color out of the screen and desaturated it, and that makes your I have a whole post on this on my website. Maybe I'll find it and I'll put it in the resources so that this community can see it. But uh I desaturate the screen. It makes your smartphone a dumb phone, essentially. You're less, wired to see the beautiful, colorful lights, and it's less stimulating for your brain, which is also a good thing. So either of those strategies are important. But maybe the best thing you could do is just turn your phone off. Try to get your phone. Now, listen, if you work in some jobs, I get it. You can't do that, right? That's impractical for you. But otherwise, getting your phone away from your bed, in a different room. Don't use it as an alarm clock. Go get an old school alarm clock. Put your phone in a different uh room of your house. Um, Turn it off, power it down, get off your phone at night, right? Read a book, spend time with your kids, do other things. So trying to get the device so that we um, not only avoid blue light, but we also start down regulating and shifting ourselves into more of a sleep rhythm rather than an alert sort of standpoint of our body. And then lastly, we're going to get into some training. And this is a commonly shared, this is like exercise physiology 101, but I want to make sure I share this with you as you're transitioning because it's important. So with this training lesson, specific adaptations to impose demands. This is the SAID principle. This is what we are like the foundation of what strength coaches do. And this is a principle in sports that says the body adapts to the demands placed on it. The body adapts to the demands that you place on it. So, the adaptations are various, right? And they're quite, I guess there's a lot of breadth to them, right? They are specific to strength, power, endurance, functional activity, joint angle, sequence of muscle activations, energy systems. Virtually all other variables that are present, your body will adapt to those, right? And it's so specific. So I'm saying this because in this example, three phenomenal world-class athletes, the best of the best, bodies are different, completely different. And they have adapted their bodies to be successful in the sport endeavor in which they chose, right? So whether it's powerlifting, whether it is endurance running, or whether it's being one of the greatest basketball players in the world, or history, I'll put it at that, a bold claim here on the former athlete society, their bodies are adapted to those specific demands. So I would say this is, how would you train for each activity, right? How would you train if you wanted to be the best power lifter in the world? How would you train if you wanted to be the best endurance athlete in the world? How would you train if you wanted to be one of the best basketball athletes in the world? But more importantly, for you in this society, is what are you training for? What do you want to train for? Because your approach to that is going to be different than somebody else's. So that is also something I think is really important. And this is why in the introductions in the school community that I asked you, like, what are the sports you played for? But like, what are your goals? What do you want to train for? What are you trying to do? Because I think this community can help you grow in that aspect. So that is the lessons. Now let's see if I can do this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing. Sorry, I'm not. Oh, there it is. Pause, share, stop share. Let's do that. Okay, cool. So we worked our way through the wheel, and we've gone through part 2 of this Performance University series. So hopefully in that wheel, whether it's your body, right? And we discussed sort of the menstrual phases and the training and the adaptation surrounding that and how we focus training a little bit differently. If it's carbohydrate intake in the fueling section, right? We talked about what is a carb and why is it important, differentiating between simple sugars and complex carbohydrates. We discussed in this the mentality, right? We shared 4 phenomenal books. I think that if you have an Audible or if you have an Amazon gift card, those books would be really insightful and would be helpful for you. I talked about avoiding blue light today, right? Shifting our sleep environment. Listen, we're going to train hard, and you know this. You're a former athlete, and you're in this society. You're in this school group for a reason. You're going to train hard. I get that, but in it, right? We got to make sure that we're recovering harder, right? So shifting away from some of the blue light into a more restful sleep state will allow you to train harder because you'll recover harder. And then lastly, specific adaptations to impose demands. And why this is important is because your body will adapt to whatever stimuli and stimulus that you put on it. So if you wanted to train for running a marathon, now that you're done with your playing career, we can train for that, but your training would look different than if you're training for 315-pound bench press or training to dominate your pickup game Sundays that you play with your friends, right, on the basketball court. If you wanted to dominate on your softball league, church league, your training would look differently. So, I asked you to share sort of what you wanted to train, some of your goals. And so head over to the discussion boards, share, create a post, and tell me a little bit about your training, because I want to hear about what you're training for. And then again, in this module, leave some comments down below. I want you to share what you took away from it, what you're going to try to apply in this next week, in this next month, what resonated with you, because this is the stuff I share with our student athletes, the current ones that I work with, every single day, because it's really important. And I know it's going to be important for you. Appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in, and can't wait to record the next one of these for you.